Russian Revolution, looking at social histories. This one has been on the 1960s, recording a kind of 50 years ago. It's a long 1960s we've dealt with. We've been inviting either historians or people who know about it, or in fact sometimes they are the same anyway. And we have Brecht today. But before I say more about Brecht, some details. Toilets are on the stairs. I can't remember which floors, but if you go to the stairs and go up or down, you'll find whichever one you want. Also, there's something important here. This is the second to last meeting. If you go to the website, you'll find there's a meeting in between this one and the one by Robin Spencer. It's been cancelled. That's the one by, I think it's Brian Hanley.
He wasn't able to come.
Yeah, he couldn't come, so we've cancelled it, obviously. But it's still on the website, so please don't be deceived. There's one more left. It's by Robin Spencer. It's on the 2nd of July, and I've forgotten where the room is, but
it's in here.
Yeah. It's in this room.
Yeah.
In this room.
It's jointly organised with the Radical Anthropology Group, who are kind enough to lend us this room, so to be in here on Tuesday evening at 6:45 on that.
Okay, 6:45. Okay.
But they tend to start a little bit later, you see.
Lots of room for confusion.
To be here at 6:30.
You get here for 6:30, have some tea, relax, you'll be okay. All right. A general thing. So these take place quite often in academic surroundings, but they're organised by groups of people who may have some relationship with academia, but this is not an academic project. We have an interest in social movements, and we're interested in people who've got an interest in social movements, and we get different people along here at different times. We've been particularly interested in, if you like, from below, or looking at what people are actually doing, rather than a kind of heavy downwards theory. You could put it like that anyway. Okay, so today we have workers in Nasserist Egypt, so that fits our long 1960s. The talk is by Brecht de Smet, over here, who has come from Belgium in order to speak to us from the lovely city of Ghent. Yeah, lovely city of Ghent. I advise you to visit if you can. He has written 2 books and a number of articles. There's one by Haymarket, which is the Dialectical Pedagogy of Revolt, and that's roughly about this period. It deals with this period.
It's the more recent events.
Oh, is it?
But it looks back.
Oh, okay. All right.
Far enough.
And then also Gramsci on Tahrir. This is by Pluto, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Egypt, and I think Tahrir gives you a clue, I think, of the topic of that, doesn't it? Yes. Okay. So the usual thing here is half an hour, and then ask questions and so on. So, Brecht, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you for the invitation. Pleasantly surprised. You have to forgive my Belgian accent. I'll do my best to be comprehensible. So, I'm Brecht. I studied history, Arabic, and did my PhD in political science. My main field research was between 2008 and 2015 in Egypt, and I started my research at around 2008, when there were already many interesting social movements in Egypt, and I especially focused my research on the relation between political activists and social activists, especially trade union activists, because in this period a lot of workers were struggling and trying to establish their own trade unions independent from the main state union. So it was a very interesting time, and of course when the uprising in 2011 happened, everything that already, every struggle that already was taking place, everything accelerated, everything massified on a totally different scale. And unfortunately, by 2013, we saw Sisi taking power, and then this whole struggle, which was taking place on a national scale, again began to diminish or fragment into very local workplace struggles. I won't focus my talk on this very interesting topic tonight, of course, because we're talking about workers in Nasserist Egypt, but perhaps in the discussion we can talk more about recent events. So, still, I want to talk a bit about recent events, because on the one hand, I think history is important to comprehend what's happening now, because as we will see, a lot of Nasser's and the heritage of the Nasser regime is still living through to this day. But on the other hand, it's also important to look at history from what's happening today in order to comprehend what happened in the past. So let's rewind a bit to 2011. Of course, many of us still recall what happened at Tahrir, this massive occupation of Tahrir Square, a very spontaneous uprising which started 25th of January. 18 days of uprising, not only in Cairo at Tahrir Square, but throughout the whole of Egypt, involving workers, students, young people who were employed, parts of the middle classes, into one big national movement against President Mubarak and the whole regime. The 18 days of uprising ended with a coup by the military. We may forget this, but the real, let's say, insurrectionary part of the revolutionary process ended in February, because part of the military, Supreme Council of Armed Forces, they took over power and promised a democratic transition. In reality, this meant a new phase in the revolutionary process, where we saw a reorganization of counter-revolutionary forces led by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, so the military, in tandem with police and security forces. In this phase also meant a new sectarianization of the conflict, so when people came together during the 18 days, there were no clashes between Copts and Muslims, but the period, especially after March 2011, we saw a confrontation more and more between the Coptic minority and Muslims, and also between more secular inclined opposition members and, for example, the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood, so the religious parties. The SCAF really was quite heavy-handed in its repression of popular revolt. So by 2012 we saw a clash between, on the one hand, the old regime with presidential candidate Ahmed Shafiq, and on the other hand the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohamed Morsi. And for many Egyptians, so 2012 presidential elections, this represented what they called a lemon vote, because they had to squeeze a lemon above their head when they went to the voting, when they went to the polls, because on the one hand they had to choose between the booth of the military regime, or, in a very Orientalist way, perhaps the scimitar of the Brotherhood. So this was not what the revolutionaries had hoped for. Still, Mohamed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate, won the elections. And then at the very start there was a hope that he would change the military regime, that he would get rid of the whole military elite in Egypt. And at the beginning he appeared to do precisely this, because Field Marshal Tantawi, who was the head of the SCAF, he was retired. But in reality, Morsi still protected military interests. For example, military budget was still shielded from parliamentary oversight, so the military, no one knows really how much the budget of the military is, what the military does with its budget, and the Muslim Brotherhood still kept those privileges for the military still. Within Egyptian society, there was more and more protest against the policies of Morsi because he did not really initiate a real democratic transition. His policies remained very neoliberal, in line with those of President Mubarak. So there was increasing protest, and they said that, yeah, look, Morsi is just a new pharaoh. Okay. So then in 2013 we had a new kind of mass social movement called Tamarot, or rebel, against the regime of Morsi. And this was an important phase in the revolution because on the one hand it really represented a mass street mobilization from below, but on the other hand it was immediately infiltrated by the military and security forces who want to get rid of the Brotherhood, and this eventually ended in the taking over power by Sisi, General Sisi, who became the new president. So we see in this very evocative picture how Sisi is both a lion and an eagle. All right. So this is very briefly, of course, what happened between 2011 and 2013. What is interesting for my talk today is how the figure of Nasser still overshadows this whole process. On the one hand, in 2011 we saw posters with Nasser, but especially in the phase of 2013, the mass movement which led to Sisi's presidency, we saw this relationship between Nasser on the one hand and Sisi on the other hand. So there was this idea that both were similar, or that Sisi wanted to do the same thing as Nasser did. So let's go back into history and the role of Nasser. And the problem, I think, with the image of Nasserism, which still pervades the movement today, is that it's a very ambiguous heritage. Because on the one hand, Nasser is very much respected within Egypt and the Arab world at large. He is one of the founding leaders of Arab nationalism, the idea that the Arab nations are one region, one nation, in fact, that they should get rid of colonial and neo-colonial exploitation, played a key role in anti-imperialist movements, not only in Egypt, if we think about the Suez crisis, but throughout the whole global south, with the Bandung conference, for example. He challenged the ownership of big landlords in the countryside, so he established land reforms which benefited small farmers. Under Nasser, living standards of ordinary Egyptians increased. There were quite relatively high wages for industrial workers. People were allowed to get a university degree. Much more people were allowed within university walls. Also women. Women became doctors, engineers, etc. under Nasser. And finally, also very important, Egypt really became the cultural nexus of the whole Arab world. Of course, at the same time, Nasser was a very authoritarian figure, and the Nasserist regime was, as a whole, a military dictatorship. And this aspect of Nasserism is still quite problematic today, both for the Egyptian left, but also within the workers' movement. So let's rewind bit back further in time. Into the 1940s, of course, we could go all the way back to the establishment of modern Egyptian workers' movement, but let's go back to the 1940s. And in the 1940s, there was already a strong and vibrant workers' movement in Egypt. And the workers' movement that did not only play, let's say, a purely social or economic role, in the sense of fighting for better living standards, but also for quite concrete political goals. So firstly, against the continued presence of British troops, for example, around the Suez Canal, but also against what was called feudalism in Egypt, the power of big landlordism, which was seen as holding back Egypt's potential to develop. So there were relatively strong independent trade unions, which were sometimes led by communists, sometimes by nationalists, but quite independent from the political scene. On the other hand, there was an important nationalist movement, democratic movement for national liberation, which was also supported by trade unions. And finally, the other big opposition force, of course, was the Muslim Brotherhood, which organized especially more artisanal workers that were not really integrated into the modern industrial process, which in Egypt at that period still revolved mainly around textile manufacturing. So there was a big trade union movement. There were opposition parties, but still throughout the 40s, neither, let's say, the more labor-oriented opposition parties nor the Brotherhood was able to kick out the British or to organize an uprising against the monarchy, because Egypt was still ruled by a monarchy which was supported by the British. And then 25 January 1952, also 25 January, there was a spontaneous insurrection in the streets of Cairo and elsewhere, and this really took the regime by surprise. So it was a spontaneous revolt. Organized political activists were surprised themselves by the revolt and then joined the protests instead of leading and organizing them. And this phase led between January and July to a disorganization of the power of the state, but not really to the formulation of a concrete alternative, a political alternative, an alternative view of how Egypt should be organized. So there was a power vacuum, and this power vacuum was solved in a military way by a coup in July 1952, when the free officers decided to establish themselves as the new leadership of Egypt. So this coup throughout the history and has been interpreted in different ways. So I mean, it's obvious it's a coup because you have military officers taking over power. That's like the very definition of a coup. But other scholars or political activists say, but it was much more than a coup, because if you look at the consequences of what happened, both politically, Egypt became independent really, especially after the Suez Crisis in 1956. Socially, the whole country was transformed from this backward feudal country to a modern nation. So we have to say, if you look at the consequences of this event, that this was really a revolutionary moment. Of course, it was still a coup. So others say, okay, we accept that the consequences of this event was quite revolutionary for Egyptian society as a whole, but it's still a coup. So it's a revolutionary coup, a coup with revolutionary consequences. And then, if we go further, then, I mean, what really happened, I think, and other progressive scholars also think that it was really a revolutionary movement from below, which was appropriated by a coup. And a lot of the positive consequences, a lot of the achievements of the coup were in fact, despite this demobilization of the movement from below. If we look at what happened to the workers' movement, for example, workers were, and especially the leaders of the big trade unions were very positive towards the coup, because they thought, all right, this will solve all our problems in one big sweep. And at, for example, a steel factory at Kafr Douwer, a textile factory at Kafr Douwer, workers went spontaneously on strike to show their support for the coup. What did the new free officer regime do, with Nasser as its head figure? It detained the leaders of the strike. They said they were communist agitators, and they hanged them. And this was sending really a very strong message to the organized labor movement at that time, that we will provide for you, but you have to stop organizing, and you will lose your independence and autonomy as a movement. And this is precisely what we see from 1952 until, let's say, the end of the 1960s, is really under Nasserism, the destruction of the independent workers' movement, which was really strong in the 1940s. So this is an image that is less known if we think of Nasserism. I mean, immediately we think of a very progressive content of social achievements, of political achievements, cultural achievements, but this happened on the back of a very strong, very vibrant, independent workers' movement. So in my work I use the work of Antonio Gramsci to understand what happened in Egypt. I won't go too much into detail about his theory. I mean, everyone knows the concept of hegemony, of course, although I think it's often perhaps too narrow defined as like cultural hegemony within cultural studies, which is a very tame interpretation of what Gramsci meant. I mean, when Gramsci speaks about hegemony, it's about class leadership, very clear. It's about class leadership, which can be political, social, cultural, and so on. Gramsci does not only speak, of course, about hegemony. I mean, he also talks about how this class leadership can be achieved. So, coercion is the oldest way to achieve this kind of rule. But then he says, in some situations when there is a political struggle that cannot be resolved, when you have one party that is as strong as another party, you have like a tendency towards Caesarism. Caesarism is almost the same concept as Bonapartism, which Marx uses. So there comes like a third actor, and he tries to solve the dispute between two groups or two classes as playing the role of an arbiter, but at the same time drawing power to himself. And this is precisely, of course, what happened in 1952. I mean, we saw how the regime was weak, but not weak enough to implode, while there was an opposition which was strong, but not strong enough to overthrow the regime. And this, in 1952, led to eventually the coming to power of the free officers as a kind of third force. And then finally, his concept of passive revolution is also very interesting, because I mean, if we think about revolution and state formation in the 19th century in Europe, we think about the French Revolution and all these big events. Gramsci says, if we look at state formation in Western Europe during the 19th century, a lot of political and economic changes were made from above by absorbing social movements, political movements into the project of the state, especially in places where the bourgeoisie was very weak. And again, if you look at Egypt, and in fact a large part of the global south, it's a region where the bourgeoisie historically was very weak, and where the state took over the role of developer. And especially in Egypt, I mean, we also see this lack of initiative from the bourgeoisie's part, and how the state became the main developer of the nation, also by trying to absorb parts of the population into this big national or nationalist project. And the same happened, of course, with the workers' movement in Egypt. So Nasserism really became the means for developing Egyptian society, and the workers' movement was really the most important pillar in this developmental project. So the workers were on the one hand revered as really the producers of the nation, but on the other hand they had no right to strike, they had no right to organize independently. So it was a very like a patron-client relation between the state and the workers. And to a certain extent, workers identified with this kind of national regime. For example, instead of the typical strike, social conflict in the Nasserist period was expressed mainly by, instead of work stoppages, by work-ins. So people, instead of halting production process, they stayed in the factory after hours, like occupying the factory, but not to take over control themselves, but by showing how productive they were, how loyal they were to the nationalist idea of raising the nation, producing really the nation. So in order to have like a moral claim on the regime. So it was as if they wanted to show their credentials as loyal, productive Egyptians, and to put moral pressure on the regime to give them, for example, a higher wage, a higher bonus, or to have any other demand. And this worked to a large extent, as long as the regime was capable economically to play this redistributive role. So as long as the economy was doing well. In the second half of the 1960s, we see that the Egyptian economy, because of a lot of reasons I won't go into detail right now, was doing quite badly. It was stagnating, and this stagnation was of course worsened with the Six-Day War in 1967 against Israel, which Egypt lost, which led to the occupation of the Sinai and the Suez Canal, which was an enormous economic blow, but it was also an enormous blow for the prestige of Nasser and the prestige of the Arab nationalist project as a whole. And this in fact led to Nasser's resignation. So Nasser said, "I've lost the war, I resign," and we see a movement in the streets demanding, "Oh, Nasser, come back to us, lead us." Nasser comes back, but the power relations have shifted. And right at this point, 1967, we see street politics returning in Egypt. So students begin to protest, and workers begin to protest again. And of course, the year 1968 is crucial for Egypt as well. So on the one hand, we have like the global 1968 protests that happened in France, US, everywhere, but also in the global south. And there is like an entwinement between these global protests on the one hand, because students, they are Egyptian students, of course, abroad as well. They bring these experiences back to Egypt, so there is this external global element. And on the other hand, there are a lot of things happening in Egyptian society as well. So these two elements become entwined. In 1968, steel workers in Helwan begin to strike because they are emboldened by what they see as the weakness of the regime. So what's often portrayed as a catastrophe for Arab nationalism and for the region, which is true, was also an opportunity for the workers' movement at that time to move back into the streets with its own demands. At the same time, we see thousands of students also beginning to mobilize and asking political reforms, political liberalization, because we're still in a one-party state. So again, like in the 1940s, there is a movement of workers and students. And this is a totally different interpretation of the late 1960s and the 1970s, because this struggle lasts throughout the 1970s. So we have worker protests, I think in 1972 and 1974 big. The students are mobilizing. But because at the end of the 1970s, the Islamists become much more powerful, there was this idea that in the 1970s, Arab nationalism went down, lost its prestige, and immediately, like, political Islam was there to replace Arab nationalism. I think this is a story that forgets the important role of worker and student mobilization in this time, and the potential to formulate an alternative between, on the one hand, Arab nationalist dictatorship, and on the other hand, political Islam. So we have Sadat, of course, who was the successor of Nasser, who really, on the one hand, he, let's say, he weakened the social base of the regime because he implemented as one of the first regimes in the global south neoliberal policies together with Chile. Egypt was one of the, let's say, pioneers of neoliberal policies in the global south. And on the other hand, he continued to build the authoritarian apparatus. So the secret police, like the riot police was increased in size under Sadat and was really fortified. So you had an increased role for dictatorship on the other hand, and a dictatorship which was slowly losing its social policies and its social base. But the important thing is that at the end of the 1960s, we see a large movement of workers, of students, who were really battling, who were really fighting the regime on the one hand, and on the other hand, Islamists which were supported by the regime. So in universities we see students who are waging this kind of ideological struggle against political Islam, which was a very uneven struggle because the Islamists were funded and morally, politically supported by Sadat's regime. And on the other hand, we see a really vibrant workers' movement again in the streets. But this workers' movement had almost to start from scratch, because there had been conflicts during the Nasserist era, but with totally different methods, totally different tactics. When suddenly neoliberal policies were implied, this was no longer the nationalist state that they confronted. I mean, showing their loyalty to a nationalist state that did not care for their loyalty. I mean, they had to find new methods of struggle. And this lasted, this period of experimentation was very strong in the 1970s, until the workers' movement was repacified by Mubarak in the 1980s, and from the 1990s onward, because there was an increase of neoliberal policies, we see again this workers' movement beginning to rise. And this is, I think, if we return to my research, one of the most interesting things that I saw really saw and of course discussed with activists was the shift back from this work in strategy or tactic to what we know as the tactic of the strike. I mean, work stoppage. Because if you have a neoliberal factory owner, it can be the state, it can be a private owner, and the only thing that works to put pressure on management is to stop working. But for them it was something totally new, and it was not supported by their union because it was a state union. Under Nasser, all unions were forbidden except for the state union. So they had to develop their own unions from scratch and rebuild them from the ground up. So what happened was that it was a learning curve. They had to organize, and when the strike lasted for a few days, they had to find money to fund their strike. I mean, they stopped working, so where do you get money? So they had to involve the whole community with these kind of strikes. So we have a workers' movement who slowly began to become a drive for confrontation with not only capital or factory management, but when the factory management was the state, also confrontation with the state as well. So for example, in 2008 we saw a first uprising in Egypt, which has not been covered here in the press at all, in a city in the Nile Delta, Mahal al-Kubra, which is like the biggest textile center in the whole of the Middle East. And there was an uprising of workers in Mahal al-Kubra. They were supported by the broad community, but at that point this uprising was still repressed by the regime because it was only in one town, and the Baha'u'llah workers were not able to establish solidarity and alliances with other parts of the country. I'll leave it at that. Perhaps in the discussion we can go into more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brecht.